Hello everyone, welcome to our today's lesson. This is History of Mass Communication, BJL1105, and my name is Faith Njeringure. And in our today's lesson, we'll be looking at different things. Now that we're looking at history of mass communication, and we'll have to look at the operational terms. What is communication? We'll have to understand what is communication and the process of communication itself. Also, apart from that, we'll be looking at the models of communication that has different elements that touches on the process of communication. We'll also look at the evolution of human communication. Communication started somewhere before we got into the digital revolution that we have at this point. We'll also look at the early forms of long-distance communication, and also look at the transition from oral to written communication. And to start with, we'll do an introduction and try to understand what is communication. And communication is something that we do daily, and communication is something that we cannot not do, because you cannot not communicate, or as an individual you cannot not communicate. And therefore communication is just a process of exchanging information or even ideas. You may have ideas, you may even exchange the feelings, you may exchange the thoughts, you may exchange the emotions, and you find that when this exchange is taking place, there must be the sender of these information, there must be the sender of these ideas, there must be the source of these thoughts or even the feelings and the emotions. And you find that the exchange process, these information, these ideas, these thoughts are transmitted from the sender or the source to the receiver, and the recipient is the individual who receives this information. And apart from that, you find that these information or these ideas or these thoughts or even feelings, they are transmitted via a medium or even a channel of communication. And you find that if it's during the normal conversation or the daily conversation or even interpersonal communication, you find that the channel or the channel may be the airwaves. At this moment, when you're receiving this information or even this lesson, you're receiving it via the TV, and therefore the TV is the channel of communication. When you're listening to the radio, radio is the channel of communication. When you are maybe you're communicating or even interacting with the friends via WhatsApp, via Facebook, via Instagram, you find that the Facebook, the WhatsApp, they are the channel of communication. And therefore communication is just a process, because it has to start from the sender to the receiver. There must be a medium, and for the communication to be considered to be effective or to be complete, there must be a feedback. And for it to be considered to be effective, the feedback must be correct, because it's upon the recipient or the receiver to internalize this information and to give the right response. But if the response is not correct, we cannot consider that the communication was effective. And you find that this communication can be divided into different categories. However, for today's lesson, we will focus on two different types. And number one is the verbal communication, and also there is the non-verbal communication. And you find that we can communicate verbally or non-verbally. And what we mean with verbal communication, you find that this is just the form of communication or the type of communication that is done by a word of mouth, or where you use speech to communicate. And you find that this verbal communication can be further, you can divide it into different categories or into two other categories. And number one is the oral, and the other one is written. And you'll find that people will ask or will try to query or to ask questions, is really written or the written communication or the written form of communication part of verbal communication? But we'll be looking at that in our discussion. And you find that the oral communication, words are used. And you find that these words are shared, or the communication is done by word of mouth. But with the written, there are also words, but they are not done, they are not done as a form of speech. But in a real sense, there are words which are used and they are written. And there are also even vocabulary. For example, if I decide to write a letter, or even a memo, or even a communication, or even an announcement, you find that I'll use words, and I must take care of the vocabularies, I must take care of the sentence structure, like the subject, the verb, the object for the sentences to make sense. And therefore you find that their words, however much they are unspoken, and therefore written communication still falls under verbal communication, just because words are used even if they are not spoken, but they are written words, which follows the rules of communication, or the rules of languages. If at all you're using maybe English language, there are rules that you will have to follow in order to ensure that you are really communicating. And therefore that's just category number one of a type of communication, and that is verbal communication. The other category is non-verbal communication, and you find that non-verbal communication, you don't use words to communicate, and you find that you're just sending wordless messages to the recipient, or you're sending wordless messages to different people, or to the people that you want to receive communication. And you find that there are different types of non-verbal communication, and we have the haptics. Haptics is just a form of communication where you communicate through touch. I have seen people communicating through haptics. For example, if you have a friend who is mourning or who is going through difficulties and you want to comfort them, you can even tap their back as you try to comfort them. It's part of communication, because you are showing that you care, or you're mourning with them, and therefore haptics is just a form of communication through touch. There is also the proxemics, and proxemics is where you communicate via distance, and you find like at this point proxemics are really being used, because everywhere you go, in private institutions, in public institutions, in gatherings, we are told to maintain the distance, the 1.5 meter distance, and therefore that's a form of communication. And we can even see the labels saying that you're supposed to stand here, you're not supposed to sit here, and it's part of communication because you're communicating. It's a form of communication that communicates via the distance. And you find that I've seen even people making comment, hey, huyu amenikaribia aje, because he's a stranger or she's even a stranger. It's still communicating. If a stranger gets too close to you, you'll start getting curious. Maybe he wants to do something that is fishy, or something that is queer, and therefore at the end of it all you find that the proxemics still communicate, and they are non-verbal. You don't have to use words to make people understand that so and so are too close, or they are not too close. And therefore there is also another form of non-verbal, that is the appearance, how we appear in terms of clothing, in terms of cosmetics, in terms of hairstyles. You find that we are able to identify different group of people, or even different religions, or even different people based on how they dress, or the mode of dressing, or how the type of the dress code. And therefore you don't have to be told this is a Muslim for you to be able to know he or she is a Muslim based on the appearance, the clothing itself. You don't have to be told this is a nurse, or this is a doctor, or this is a pilot, based on how they are dressed. And also the cosmetics, how we do those makeups, can still communicate something. I've also had people commenting based on the cosmetics and how people apply these makeups. It also communicates something. And also hairstyle also communicates something. I've seen comments based on the different hairstyles, and nowadays it's as if every person wants to go natural, and people are trying to maintain their natural hair, and therefore it's all about hairstyles, and they are communicating something. We're able to identify our colleagues from Jamaica based on their hairstyles. We're also able to identify other people based on their hairstyles, and therefore also hairstyles can communicate something, and it's still part of appearance. Also there is the surrounding, and you find the surrounding, it's just the context or the environment itself. When you walk into a room and you find maybe a dining table, or you find some seats, you don't have to be told this is a dining room or even a dining hall. When you get into a bedroom, you don't have to be told this is a bedroom, because automatically you'll find a bed, a mattress, and other things. And therefore you find the surrounding and how that you know, the surrounding, the furnishing of the surrounding can really communicate whether this is a bedroom, this is a classroom, this is a church, based on how it's furnished. Also, lighting is used to communicate. We have seen when there are events, you find that a lot of lighting is used to communicate, and especially also in the movie, you'll find that lighting changes with scenes. You find if there are scenes that are portraying a lot of maybe a lot of comedy, there are different types of lights that will be used. If at all it's about maybe a morning session, the lighting will still change, and therefore lighting can as well communicate something. Also, there is body language, and these are the facial expressions, the postures, and the gesture. You don't have to be told that someone is tired based on their posture and also their gesture. And also, you don't have to be told that someone is not happy or they are happy based on how they use different facial expression. If you find someone frowning, if you find someone laughing anyhow, it still communicates something, and you'll hear even some funny comments based on how people are expressing their facial expressions. Also, there is the sound, and with the sound, this is more volume, the rate of speech, the tone itself. You find also the volume communicating, also the rate of speech and the tone. For example, if someone is very angry, you find that the rate of speech tends to vary. In fact, if someone is communicating in a very big room, you find also the volume. Those who are behind will not get maybe the information that the speaker is relaying, and therefore will have maybe to have some mics to communicate the information, and therefore volume communicate. In fact, maybe in the public speaking art, you find that volume is used as a key element to look at maybe whether the speaker was nervous or he was not nervous. And you find that the volume itself communicates the exposure of the speaker, whether the speaker was nervous or not even nervous, whether he was prepared or not even prepared, because it's not expected that the speaker will use a low volume. And therefore volume, rate of speech, and tone as well communicate a lot as far as nonverbal communication is concerned. And to proceed with, we'll look at the communication itself in terms of the models of communication. And with the models of communication, you find that they have been categorized into three. There is the linear, there is the transactional, and also the interactive model. And we'll start with the linear model, which is the simplest. And you'll find that the other two models has, you know, it's an improvement of, they are an improvement as far as the linear model is concerned. And with the first model, you can see that it's not complicated. It has the source, there is the receiver, there is the noise, there is the channel or the transmitter of the information, and we'll be looking at it. And basically, when we are looking at the models, we are trying even to look at the elements of communication, because with the model, we have an element like the source, we have an element like the message, we have an element like the receiver, there is the noise, but we'll be looking at those elements as we discuss these models. And the first model, which is a linear model, it is one of the models that was derived by the Shannons in 1949. And you find that it's a model of communication that tries to look at you know, the communication in a linear form. And you find that from the model, there is the sender, and the sender is always the originator of the message. And the sender is the person who comes up with the message. If I want maybe to send some information to someone, I'm the one to come up with information. If at all I want to tell maybe my student to come for class a bit early, or to come for class maybe on a given day, you find that I'll be the source of the information or the source of this message, and therefore the sender is always the source of the information or the originator of the message. And you find that at this point the model can look at both the verbal and non-verbal communication, because even the gestures communicate, or the non-verbals communicate. Because if I want to tell someone that I'm not even interested maybe in talking to them, or not even interested maybe in accompanying them, I can still use the gestures or even the non-verbals to communicate. If I want to tell someone or even to communicate that we are departing, I can still use my hand to wave bye as a form of communication. And if I wave, I'll still be the source of this information. But if I also as well, if I tell them that no, I'll not be able to accompany you, or no, let's see each other on another day or a given day, you find that I'll still be using the words and I'll still be communicating verbally. And you find that the sender goes through a process of encoding to translate ideas and emotions into code. And you find that this information is then transmitted to the receiver, who decodes the information, and after decoding the information, internalizing and trying to analyze the information, they send their message back. But you find that the linear model, does not have the feedback. It only have the sender, the receiver, the source, the sender who is the source, the receiver, and also the message, the channel of communication, and also the noise. And the noise, they are basically the barriers, or the barriers that comes in to interfere with the process of communication. If at all I'm doing I'm in an event and I'm giving a speech, you find that maybe the building or the surrounding may be too noisy due to the transportation, or maybe there is a construction just some few meters from the venue. You find that we can call this noise. Or maybe I have my own psychological issues. Maybe I'm too hungry, maybe I'm not feeling well, maybe I'm too tired, maybe I'm under stress. You find that these can be considered as noise, and therefore these are just the barriers or the factors that interferes with the process of communication. And you find that they can affect the whole process of communication, making the communication not to be effective. And therefore you find that basically that's all about the linear model of communication, which has only the sender, the receiver, the message, the channel, and the noise, but there is no feedback. And that's why we call it linear, just because there is no feedback. And you find that this model is applicable in different instances, or in different in different instances. And we can give an example of when an organization does a memo and maybe puts that memo in a notice board, and you find that the employees cannot even respond to the communication. Or maybe when you go somewhere, you're given information and you're not in a position even to respond. The information is sent as it is. I've seen it in the government institution, where they send the information, especially those institutions that are owned by the government. They just send the information as it is, but you find that the citizens or the publics are not in a position to respond to the communication that was made. Like there is a communication that was made prior, and it was channeled via different modes of communication about the issue of new title deeds. You find that the citizens are not in a position even to respond to the communication that has been made, because it's more of a linear communication. The government sends the information that there is new registration of the title deeds, and also you find that the government is the source. It's airing the information about title deeds, but again, we the citizens cannot give our views. We can only act without giving our views, and therefore that's all about the linear model and how it's applicable. And you find that the message will always pass through a channel or a pathway of communication. Whichever way, you can as well use the traditional media, you can use the new media, or even use the airwaves. If at all, it's about the oral communication or the face-to-face discussion. And you find that I've talked about noise, and I've said noise, they are just barriers or factors that interferes with the whole process, and it can be external, even internal. Noise can either be internal or even external, and the external may be noise from buildings, noise from infrastructures, or even the transportation. But again, internal factors touches on the psychological issues, or even maybe someone is sick, someone is hungry, maybe someone is under depression or even under stress. You find that they'll not communicate in a normal way. The other model is interactional model. It is a model that was derived or developed in 1955 by Scrum, but it's just an improvement of the linear model that we have discussed. It has all the elements that are in the linear model apart from the feedback. You find that with the interactional model, there is the source, the receiver, there is the message itself, there is the channel of communication. But again, there is another element, which is the feedback. At this point, the recipient or the receiver of the information is able to decode the message, interpret the message, internalize the message, and give the intended feedback. And therefore, this is the interactional model or the convergence model. And you find that it takes place even in our daily activities. Whenever we are communicating with our friends, maybe from overseas or even from different areas, when you're using the internet to communicate, you find that communication is interactive. When I'm sending a message to a friend via WhatsApp, they'll read the message, and then they'll respond to my message, and therefore we can call that interactive communication, because the receiver receives the information and is able to respond to the information. And you find that a lot of decentralization has taken place, especially with digital revolution and with internet. You find that it has really increased the opportunity of interactive communication. And you find that it is still evolving. We are still having new apps, new, online platforms that we are using to communicate. And a very good example, you find even different entities and different bodies are using the online platform to communicate with the public or even with the citizens. And you find, like, for example, in the recent, there's a case, and a case on one prime suspect by the name Christian Kadima. It's a case that we know when a lawyer by the name Elizabeth Koki was murdered. And you find that the DCI, with their online platform or with their online pages, they air the information about anyone who knew Christian Kadima, or someone who could disclose the information about him, because he was hiding, and he was a prime suspect. And you find that even people from South Africa, they could tell that he was not Nigerian. Others would say he's a Congolese. Other information were coming even from South Africa, that he was wanted. He was a wanted suspect because he had committed a crime of battery. But you find that it was out of this internet, and you find that it was more of interactive communication, and people could communicate from South Africa, others from Nigeria, and they would still give more information. In fact, others would still say that it's not only this murder that he was involved in. There is a time he had beaten someone in a gym, and people would give their views and also their opinion, and others would even prove that in fact he was not a good person. But you find that it's out of that aspect of interaction, such that people could as well interact, and therefore that's just a model of interactional. And this is where people interact, or people are able to send information, receive, and also give the feedback. There is also the other model, which is a transactional model. It's a bit complicated, but we will try to discuss and try to understand the whole aspects of this transactional model. And you find that the transactional model, you find that it's where communication is simultaneous. The same time the sender is sending the information, the receiver is also trying to internalize and also give their feedback. And you find that maybe a very good example is when we are engaging in our daily conversation. You have a friend or you're in a group of people and you're trying to discuss, maybe you have a heated debate concerning maybe the issues that are trending. Like today we understand there is the inauguration of Joe Biden, and you find maybe you're discussing such an issue, and you find that with these the communication can be simultaneous, because the sender and the receiver, they are engaging in sending and receiving of the message. At the same time, you can be the sender, and at the same time you can be the receiver. What if you're discussing an issue concerning maybe the inauguration? Was it supposed to be held today? You know, was even Trump supposed to be, you know, impeached twice? You know, maybe you're having that discussion. You can be the sender, you're giving out your opinion, you're giving out your ideas, and also the recipient can still be the sender giving out their opinion. They don't have to respond based on whatever information you've given to them. They can as well come up with their own ideas and also their own opinion and give it to you. And you find that at that point you can say it's transactional, because at the same time you are the sender and you are the recipient of the message. And you find that the transactional model of communication gives a real world model of interpersonal communication by illustrating that people communicating act simultaneously as the sender and the receiver in a cooperative fashion. And therefore at the same time you can be the receiver, and at the same time you can be the sender. And therefore that's all about the transactional model. And you find that with that the communication is simultaneous. Maybe you're engaging in negotiation, maybe you want to buy a car, you want to buy a plot, maybe you even want to buy a gadget in a shop. You will engage in that transactional communication, because at some point you can be the sender, and at some point you can be the recipient of the information. And now to the history of communication. As I started by saying that communication started from somewhere. At this point we are talking of internet, we're in the era of digital revolution, but again communication started somewhere. And you find that communication started with oral communication. And as we started by saying that communication can range from nonverbal to verbal communication. And therefore, with communication back then, you find that the earliest form of communication was the speech or the oral communication. And you find that many ancient civilizations, they relied on speech for the purposes of acquiring information. They relied on storytellers, people who would come and give stories and concerning different maids, or concerning different information about the society or even the culture and skills. And therefore these people would give information via word of mouth for the purposes of handing down the history of the culture, for the purposes of handing down the skills concerning a different activity. And you find that this form of communication, or this culture, was referred to as oral or pre-literate culture. It can be referred to as oral or pre-literate culture. And you find that people could communicate without language. Maybe in the evening, kids would sit down with their grandmother, and they would give those stories to them about their origin. And I tried to internalize some of these stories that were given to us. And like really, did we fall from heaven to down, or what happened? But again, out of growing and out of experience, you learn that most of the time these were maids, but they were handed to us by those storytellers, and most of the time they were our grandmothers, our grandfathers, maybe boys when they went to graze with their grandparents or their grandfathers, or even to hunt. You know, the grandparents or the grandfathers would still give this information, the history about their cultures to these boys. Maybe also other skills like hunting. you know, this information was not written, like the guidelines and the techniques for hunting. You know, it was handed to people via word of mouth, maybe cooking. It wasn't written as like, unlike today we have recipes which are written on how to cook ugali, how to bake, how to, you know, this information is all over written. But back then it was passed by, or it was passed through the word of mouth. But we find that at the end of it all, as much as we are talking about pre-literate culture or oral communication, you find that you know, there were no books. But again, this information, you know, you had to be there face to face for this information to be relayed to you. Unlike today, you find that the other channels that enhancing this communication, you can as well communicate to people as you can see them, but using technology. But back then there was no technology, and you find that the communication was face to face. And you find that information was aired to people, or information was aired to different recipients by the talking chiefs, who are also known as griots, or the storytellers. And you find that, you know, it was more of a talent, or it was more of out of experience that people could communicate this information. You know, for you to communicate information about the culture, or even about how to hunt, or even about how to cook a given meal, they had to recite this information and to internalize them. And therefore, we can say that these griots, it's as if they were genius, because they had to have good memory for them to share this information. And mark you, they were not sharing this information to just one person. They were sharing this information to a lot of people. Maybe this week they were sharing it to a given village, the other time to a different people, after some few years to other people, and you find that they had to recite it in order to pass the information to the next generation. And you find that there are different credentials or characteristics of oral culture. And you find that, number one, meaning in language was specific and local. And why are we saying that meaning in language was specific and local? You find that, you know, back then there was no a common language for everyone. You find that the language that they were using, it was only known maybe to a given group of people, or it was only known to a given culture, or it was only known to a given tribe. And therefore, the meaning of the information that was being relayed to these people, it was just specifically meant to a given group of people. If at all I'm to communicate maybe about the origin of, like, for example, the Kikuyu people, they talk of Gikuyu and Mombi, you find that the whole thing or the history about the Kikuyu people, it's only specific to the Kikuyu. And therefore, this information about their origin cannot have a meaning maybe to people from Luo, Nyanza. And therefore, you find even back then when they were using this form of communication, maybe the speech, the language, and also the meanings were specific to a given group of people. You find back then not all communities were pastoralists. Others were farmers. Others, they relied on hunting and gathering. And therefore, the information about hunting could not maybe make a sense to the group of people who are not involved in such economic activity. Maybe the whole aspect about, you know, grazing could not even make sense to the group of people who are not involved maybe in their activity. And therefore, you find that the meaning and the language was just specific to a group of people. And you find that the members of that group highly depended on each other for all the aspects of life, just because the meaning and the language of different issues was just meant for them. Also, something else, you find that knowledge was passed orally. And the knowledge concerning different issues or concerning different skills, also specialization, you find that they were passed by word of mouth, or they were passed orally. The midwives were trained by word of mouth. How to fish, it was done by word of mouth, and therefore knowledge was just passed orally. Also, something else, you find that memory was crucial. And as I said earlier, these griots, these storytellers, these talking chiefs, they had to have a good memory. If at all, they had to pass this information for a longer period, and for a longer period, and also to a number of people. They had to have good memory on maybe good memory on training other people on how to be good midwives, on how to hunt. They had to retain this information in their memory. Also, something else, you find that the maids and the history were intertwined. Whatever we consider to be maybe the history of our cultures or the histories of our background, you find most of it is maids, and therefore whatever was communicated as history was basically maids. And you find that the storytellers are highly valued, or even back then they were highly valued because they were the meaning makers. Maybe they would relate a given issue to bad omen, or maybe they would relate a given issues and maybe try to come up with meaning. Maybe a very good example, when we were young, there are stories that we were told that when you walk during the night, you'll meet with a ghost. You find that, and you were told that there were ghosts that were white in colors, other black in colors, other red in colors. But again, you find that these were just maids, and we used to believe in them. And you find that even back then, most of the traditions, the values, the beliefs, they were the beliefs, our historical beliefs, or the historical beliefs, they are basically maids, or most of them were maids. Also, as we talk of communication, even up to date, you find that there is control of communication. Like in our media industries, there are bodies that control or regulate the communication. We have the MCK, or the Media Council of Communication, that looks at the media. Also, there is the Communication Authority of Kenya that we try to look at the licensing of these businesses. But you find even back then, control of communication wasn't really that necessary. But when it was necessary, you find that maybe those people who are involved in who made mistakes when it comes to communication, maybe they were sanctioned from attending those social gatherings, or there were even rules, or there were even activities that they could not even attend due to the mistakes that they made when they were making those communication. You find that the control of communication wasn't really necessary as it is today, as we are seeing it, media being regulated and also communication being regulated. But you find that at the end of it all, communication could not satisfy the needs that were there, because you find that there was a practical limit to what or how much one person could remember. You cannot recall everything. The source cannot recall everything, and you see information keeps on changing. And therefore, you find that with oral communication, there was a gap, because, you know, it doesn't make sense, or even back then it couldn't make sense that maybe a griot, or even a storyteller, or even a talking chief could remember everything. And you find that there was a need for growth of information and knowledge in the oral societies. And by that, you find that a need arose to communicate over distances. I'm trying to imagine if at all I'm to communicate something orally. I'm in a given county, let's assume maybe in Mombasa County, and I have to reach people from maybe Meru County. You find that I'll have to reach people within Mombasa County, go to Machakos, go to Nairobi, then go to Murang'a, go to Embu. You know, it will even take a lot of time before I reach people in Meru County. And therefore, you find that you know, the issues of distance were not catered for by oral communication, and therefore there was need to communicate over distances. And you find that voice could not travel, or information could not even be stored for a longer period, because I can imagine if a storyteller dies, he dies with his knowledge, or he dies with the information. Unlike today, we still have books of renowned scholars who died long time ago, but back then there was no form of you know, information could not even be stored for a longer period. If maybe a storyteller existed for only 5 years or even 50 years, you find that that's the longer period that the information could exist in the society. But once they are gone, they'll just die with the information, and therefore there was need to store information for a longer period and also to communicate over distance. And this led to other form of communication or other development, and we will look at other development that came to fill the gap of storage and also the gap of distance. And you find that the early forms of long distance communication, there was the smoke signals, which is still applicable even today. If you find maybe a smoke, or you see a big smoke when you're maybe somewhere and you see smoke, it's still communicating. Maybe there's an accident somewhere, or there's a building that is getting burnt, you know, it still communicates. Also drums, they are still in use today. They used to communicate, yodeling and ululation. They are still communicating even up to date. The horns, but today they are not mostly used as a part of communication. The lighting and the torches. There was also the bells and also the flags that communicated. And you find that like for example the smoke, you find that even in China, soldiers stations, you find that the soldiers stations were along the Great Wall. And when those stations were positioned there, you find that they would alert each other of an enemy by using fire. They would use fire for the purposes of communicating about an enemy. And you find that they were able to transmit a message as far as 800 kilometers in just a few minutes. And they would communicate to a selected population. And also fire was still used even in African community, but again even up to date it's still communicating. Also you find that the other form of communication that was used back then, it's the drum, and they were used for the purposes of communicating. And you find that you know, there were different rhythms that were used to communicate different messages. And you find that the tone and the pitch would mimic a spoken language. Even up to date, if you beat a drum using a given rhythm, it can mimic maybe a spoken language. And you find that maybe 3 different types that maybe were found in Africa. You find that a certain rhythm could represent a specific idea. Another one would repeat the profile of a spoken utterance. And also another one would simply be subject to musical laws. But you find that at the end of it all, the drum could communicate. And you find that the drummers were positioned as 20 miles apart. And also the conversation would take place maybe between drummers who are 5 miles apart. But again, it would still communicate something based on the rhythm that was used. And you find that after the early forms of long distance communication, there was a transition from oral communication to written. And you find that as civilization developed, it even became harder to rely on these the early forms of long distance communication and also the oral communication. And therefore there was a need for improvement, because you see, or you'll find at the end of it all, people could not even keep details. How do you even keep details of smoke? How do you even keep details of maybe the rhythms from the drum? That was back then. And you find that at the end of it all, they needed permanent and accessible material, and therefore they had to move, or there was transition from oral to written communication. And with the oral, or with the transition from oral to written communication, the oldest form was the cave paintings. And it was used for the purposes of communication. And you find that the caves were painted as a form of communication. And you find that with the paintings, you find that drawings at some point they were done. And you know, it would communicate something even with the drawing. And you find that there is the oldest known cave painting in France. And also in ancient Greece, the concept and words for drawing and writing were one and the same. And therefore also in Greece, you find that the cave paintings was as well embraced. The other form of written communication, the early form of written communication after the transition, is the petroglyphs, which was the next, and you find that it was used to record the events. And the other one was the pictograms, and you find that these were just symbols representing concept, object, activity, or place. And you find that form of early writing, they were just form of early writings where ideas were transmitted through drawing, and therefore back then people would transmit information through drawing. But you find that there is a huge difference between petroglyphs and also pictograms, and you find that the petroglyphs were simply showing an event, while pictograms were telling about an event. And you find that the pictograms were used by various ancient cultures all over the world. Thus, they were very popular more than the petroglyphs. There is also the other form, which is the ideograms or the ideograms, and you find that they evolved from pictograms. And you find that these they could, the ideograms, they could convey more abstract concept. For example, if you draw a circle, it can just be considered to be a mere circle, but if you add some strokes, it can be, you know, maybe when you ask a young kid what is this, they can tell you this is the sun, and it is on a sunny day based on the drawing. And therefore we find that with the ideograms, they were drawn, or they conveyed more abstract concepts, so that people could get information, more information, or they could get concept about the information that you're trying to relay, unlike the pictograms. And therefore there is also the logograms, and the logograms, they are just visual symbols representing words rather than sounds. And you find that they were relatively easier to remember. And a very good example of a logogram is a zebra crossing or even traffic lights, because at the end of it all, they are just visual symbols representing words. And you find that it was just a form of a transition from the oral to written, where people are using cave paintings. You know, they were using ideograms, they were using petroglyphs for the purposes of communication. But at the end of it all, you find that the transition from oral to written saw the origin of writing in Egypt, where clay was used for the purposes of communication, and straight lines, pictograms, were drawn on clay using a stylus. You find that the clay were used where people would mold clay and also use a stylus for the purposes of communication, or for the purposes of communicating. They would draw lines or straight lines using a stylus for the purposes of communication. And you find that it is the transition from oral to written, or the transition that we were talking about, the pictograms, the petroglyphs, the ideograms, that saw the origin of writing in Egypt. Also, as an improvement due to the nature of clay, you know, at the end of it all, clay can be bulky. You cannot carry many tablets, and also clay, you cannot store it for quite some time, because it all depends with the weather. When it's too sunny, they start breaking. When it's rainy, you find that you know, they'll change from solid to, you know, to liquid, based on the temperatures or based on the weather. And therefore, due to the nature of clay, it could not be stored. It was bulky. Let's assume even you want to write maybe 1,000 words. How many clay tablets will you end up using at the end of it? Or you find that due to its nature, there was a need for improvement, and there was a need for to look at a better medium of communication, or a way of communication, a better way of communication. And therefore there was adoption of papyrus. And papyrus, they were split, and the white cover that could absorb, which was more of absorbent, was used for the purposes of writing information or having information. And you find that through the papyrus, yes, it was lighter, unlike clay. And also again, it had a white part once it was split that could absorb some, you know, some ink, or even not only ink, or even some solution mixture of water and soil. You find that it could even absorb. And you find that out of use of papyrus, there was a lot of impact and a lot of changes in the society, because at the end of it all, the thought gained lightness, and therefore people started thinking for better ways of communicating other than using papyrus for the purposes of communicating. You find that they had to look for better ways of communication, and other than using strokes for the purposes of communication, you find that with the use of papyrus, it led even to the development of learning institution. Also the scribes, there was organization of scribes. And remember, as much as we are talking, or as much as we are talking about papyrus, whenever there is an invention somewhere, it attracts people, and therefore you find that there was even an aspect of urbanization back then, or people would come together and form maybe a village, or even a center. And you find out of being in a center, ideas were exchanged, thoughts gained lightness. And also remember, these people were still religious, and therefore there were even scribes back then, and for the purposes of communicating their religious activities, or even for the purposes of communicating and recording the economic activities, you find at the end of it all, it led to the growth and development of literacy. Earlier on, they were using lines for the purposes of communicating, straight lines, or they had a different form of recording information. But out of use of papyrus, out of the usage of papyrus, thought gained lightness, and they had to look for better ways of communicating, and this led to the growth and development of literacy. And you find that whenever there is literacy, you expect good things and a lot of revolution. And you find that to further the growth, there was development of print revolution by Johannes Gutenberg, because now people were not really using the papyrus. Now they had, after thoughts gained lightness, now they had to bring out the whole aspect about usage of papers, and also printing a lot of documents, especially educational materials, and also issues pertaining economic activities. And therefore the print revolution by Johannes Gutenberg really assisted when it comes to having a lot of copies, and also having a lot of information now printed on papers. And you find that as a result of this evolution or revolution by Johannes Gutenberg, it led to the to books, and also the print media, the newspapers, the magazines that we have today, and also other types of communication, print media, like the brochures, the pamphlets. You find that it was as a result of the print revolution that was brought, or the development of a movable type print machine that was invented by Johannes Gutenberg. And you find that as an improvement, books came, print media came, the newspapers, the magazines, and the other print media that we know at this moment. And to, this was just written. And to bring out the whole aspect about the audio part, you find that to further the communication, as much as people are communicating about education activities, about maybe the daily happenings that were happening maybe in different towns, there was need to have the audio part of it. And as an improvement, or to further communication, there was a development of radio. And you find that Hertz and Marconi, they really spearheaded the development of radio, which was followed by other developments by Lee De Forest. And you find that radio was really used, especially during the world wars, for the purposes of communicating the activities, and also for the purposes of communicating different propagandas that saw or heightened the war. And you find that later on, the radio development led to TV invention, because as much as we are talking about radio, you know, it doesn't even incorporate the visual aspect. And as we know, TV is a cool media that allows both audio and visuals, and therefore to further communication and to allow people to view as they listen, radio came along, then TV, and through TV people could even view the information, and also they could see the pictures. And you find that for effective and unlimited communication, and especially decentralization, you find that now we have a key invention, especially that we have really incorporated in every aspect of our communication, the internet, which led to digital revolution and made communication efficient. And at this moment, we are even talking of the traditional media being in the internet. We are talking of online TVs, we are talking of online radio, we are talking of online newspapers. At this point, I don't have to have a TV set for me to watch the news. I can as well follow the live news from internet or from different platforms that I can only get them online. And you find that basically that is the historical background of communication. It started from oral, then there was transition from oral to written, and out of and with the key developments when it comes to written communication, you find that at the end of it all there was a key development that was spearheaded by Johannes Gutenberg, which saw the print media, and out of you know, to further the communication, there was key development, the radio that brought the audio aspect, and also apart from that there is the TV, which brought the visual aspect, and later on there was the internet, which brought a lot of decentralization, and which has led to a lot of convergence, where we have seen the traditional media converging to the internet. And also apart from that, you find that the internet necessarily, it did not come to replace the traditional media, but it came with the key elements or key activities or key achievements that has really enhanced the traditional media, and which has made communication efficient. But again, there are challenges that are associated with the internet. Now that it's a virtue, it's something that cannot be regulated, and you find that most of the laws that were designed by the supranational bodies and also the local bodies, you find that they are not being able to regulate the internet, but those are key areas that can be looked at. But again, the internet has really led to a lot of revolution and made communication easier, cheaper, and also efficient. And that marks the end of our today's lesson. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you.